Hi everyone, welcome. In this video, we're going to be discussing Franz Kafka, our next author. This is going to take us into some slightly new terrain because Kafka is not really known as technically speaking, a philosopher. He's really a writer of literature. Although I think we'll see from the story, the Metamorphosis, that there's quite a lot of philosophical speculation and a lot of philosophical ideas floating around in the story. So just to give you a little bit of an orientation regarding who Franz Kafka, the person, was and what some of the main ideas were that motivated the piece. Kafka is born in 1883 and he lives to 1924. Um, he writes in German, although his German is combined with quite a lot of Czech because he's from the Czech Republic. He writes novels. He's very famous for a novel called The Trial, which sort of is kind of a dark critique of totalitarianism and bureaucracy, and yeah, raises quite a lot of existential issues there. And then there's a lot of short stories in his body of work, as well as parables. And for a major writer, and Kafka is known as a major writer of the century, he didn't write very much. From what we understand, he probably burned about 90% of everything he ever wrote. So the remainder is just a small fraction of his total output. And Kafka has, of course, come to be associated with the idea of the Kafkaesque. In other words, his namesake is one which evokes the connotation being strange, being dark, a certain element of the fantastical. And you can see from the Metamorphosis right away that his stories are both horrifying, but also kind of funny, and very, very supernatural. Okay, so the only way to understand what the Kafkaesque is to really experience the story for yourself. Okay, so this is Kafka here as a young man, and we can see his peering, imaginative eyes, perhaps concocting a story, right? That will go into his canon. Okay, so biographically speaking, Kafka is born into a middle class, squarely middle class Jewish family in Prague. Prague being in modern day Czech Republic, but at the time was part of the greater Moravia or Austro-Hungarian Empire. Um, he is not a professional writer at all, actually. He does not really spend, or rather, he does not get recognition for his writing during his own lifetime. He spends his life as a kind of a lowly bureaucrat. Well, maybe not lowly, but not particularly well known within an insurance agency. And we'll see a little bit of that kind of dynamic, or perhaps that culture in the story, right? So compare maybe Kafka to the figure of Gregor Samsa in the Metamorphosis, right? And what from Kafka's life can maybe help us there, right? What does it mean to be a fairly anonymous bureaucrat working um, behind behind the scenes, as it were? This is a frequent preoccupation. So as I said before, Kafka is largely anonymous. His passion is his writing, though. So even though he's working uh, for an insurance company without much recognition, he would spend all of his nights devoted to his fiction, where he was creating really amazing, fantastical worlds that he would share with his friends and his family in private, but without much circulation. Um, he very tragically dies pretty young of tuberculosis in a sanatorium, and the actual cause of death was starvation. And Kafka, I think, was a person who struggled with a lot of sickness in his life, and I think we can pick up a little bit in the story a worry or a concern with what it means to have a body that is perhaps disabled or sick or in pain. I think the story is filled with descriptions of a body in pain and obviously a body disfigured or alien. And so I think that has a very personal sort of basis in Kafka's own life as someone who struggled with his own ailments. Okay, so to talk a little bit about the Metamorphosis, which the original German is Die Verwandlung. We could translate that as the transformation, and others have translated it as the transformation, but it's come to really be known as the Metamorphosis. So the story finally comes out in 1915, and it's a very notorious, infamous, and now kind of classic piece of literary modernism. And in some circles, it is known as the bug story for obvious reasons, right? And so this is a still image from the first edition of the story. Let's have a look at the very first line, the very opening. The story famously opens with a bang, right? When Gregor Samsa, sorry, it should say Samsa with an S, woke one morning from troubled dreams, he found himself transformed right there in his bed into some sort of monstrous insect. Very bizarre and inexplicable opening to a story. How could he, a human being, be transformed into a monstrous insect? He seems to have been sleeping from troubled dreams, so some people have supposed that this whole story will be a dream and that it's not real at all. You could perhaps interpret it that way. I think the story is very open to these possibilities. But you will notice that Kafka, what part of what his experiment is in the story, as it were, is to begin the action with this totally impossible, totally wild, totally gothic and horrific phenomenon, but then to unravel the whole details of the story with painstaking scientific realism. So he is combining, and this is known as magic realism, he is combining the magical or the fantastical with the real in a kind of explosive amalgam. So ask yourself this question as you're reading the story. Why choose to do this? Why choose to describe what is impossible with very realistic, almost medicinal and scientific terminology, right? So this term monstrous insect, you're probably asking yourself, well, what is Samsa exactly? Has he become a some kind of some translations will say verminous insect. Is he a cockroach? Is he a beetle? All kinds of theories have been put out there. I think it's a misreading of Kafka to try to identify the one thing that he most definitely is, because I think Kafka is trying to get us to live in this space where things are not certain. Everything is a little bit out of joint, and things don't really have very clear definitions. Okay, so but for the sake of the beginning, just know that he has transformed into this huge, oversized insect of sorts, or vermin, or monster. And of course, a lot of the story will have to do with his family's reaction to this transformation. What do you do with such an event if you are the sibling of Gregor, if you're a parent of Gregor? And try to pay attention to the opening where, try to detail for yourself what are Gregor's thoughts? What is his thought process? You'll notice that a lot of his thoughts after this transformation are very surprisingly pedestrian. They're surprisingly ordinary, right? He wonders about getting to work on time. He wonders about catching his train, not upsetting his boss. It is suggested that his family is a little bit in debt to the company that he works for. So what is Gregor's occupation? He's a traveling salesman, right? And so there's already a little bit of overlap between Gregor, the character, and perhaps Kafka, the real person. And what we know is that Gregor doesn't seem to have much of a life, right, outside of his job. He spends a lot of time traveling. It's reported that he will often spend free time just studying the um, schedules of the train departures so that he can get to his destinations, right? So he's very fixated in a kind of narrow-minded way on this job. And now that he's had this transformation, he obviously can't go to work very well, right? So what does he do? He rolls around in bed for a while and kind of hits his snooze alarm, as it were, and has this thought to himself, well, maybe if I can get some more sleep, this will run its course and I'll feel better and I'll be able to go, right? Well, of course, it doesn't run its course, and he seems to be stuck in the first chapter. All right, so this is his predicament. Here's a little image. There's tons of images trying to capture a little bit what we're talking about. This would be a very oversized Gregor in his human bed. Yeah, so we have to have the feeling that this is not only a disgusting animal, but a huge, oversized, unwieldy animal who is in no way going to be avoidable, is in no way going to be able to fit in his human-sized bedroom and bed. So this is a disastrous kind of situation. And pay attention, by the way, to descriptions throughout the story of space, the dimensions of space. I think Kafka is trying to really do something there. He is obsessed with whether or not people are well suited to be in space. There's a lot of descriptions of doors opening and closing. It's been suggested that that is a kind of metaphor for whether or not someone belongs in the realm of the human, or someone is being excluded from the human, or someone is passing through as a point of transition to some kind of status as being marginal or alien to the human. So do take notice of these little descriptions of space. I think they are significant. Okay, so this is the actual term for that monstrous insect. It's actually very hard to translate. In the German, it's ungeheures Ungeziefer. And yeah, no translator has really been able to fully figure out how to render this in English. So we call it monstrous vermin. Other translators will say insect. But there's a lot of other meanings packed into these terms. You will notice that there's an and an and those are both negatives in German. So this is a double negative. So Gregor is like really abject. He is really awful. He is really monstrous. He is the most maximally unclean and disgusting and monstrous being that you can imagine. So there's a lot of resonance of it being unclean. But then there's another meaning, which is very interesting, which is that it tends to mean that you're so filthy that you're actually an animal not even fit for sacrifice in a religious ritual. So we'll talk about this, but Kafka is for sure going to have some religious and theological themes throughout the story. It's going to be hard to say in advance before experiencing the whole plot, but maybe just ask for yourself, what is Kafka doing here? Why is he trying to describe Samsa in this sort of religiously loaded term, to not be fit for sacrifice? Does this mean that he has been cast out of the world of the human by God? Is he trying to do something with the story of Christ's sacrifice and crucifixion? We'll return to the array of Christological metaphors that are in the story, because there are plenty of them. But just hold in mind, for the sake of beginning the action, that Gregor is really the most disgusting and kind of profane being that you can imagine. Okay. This is an image I pulled from Vladimir Nabokov's lectures on Kafka from his notes to literature. I don't know if you could really see this, but Nabokov thought it interesting to try to draw a cutaway of the apartment where the Samsa family lives. So this is sort of a brief, yeah, it's a cutaway, a blueprint, if you will, where all the action of the metamorphosis will take place. So this, you should consider this to be a fairly crammed space, right, where the whole family and the maid and the charwoman will have to interact. There will be a lot of scenes outside of Gregor's bedroom where the family is gathered at the dining room table. The father, it is pointed out, likes to read his morning newspaper and have very long breakfasts at the breakfast table. And again, and Nabokov makes this point that the apartment is divided in an almost carapace-like way, as if it itself is a kind of insect body of sorts, with doors opening and closing to the different partitions of the body. Maybe so. I don't know if I agree with Nabokov there, but there is a way in which Kafka is trying to get us to inhabit an environment that is very cramped and very claustrophobic, and therefore, because of Gregor's presence, very clean and very a little bit imposing, a little bit damned, right? I think that's the idea here. Okay, so this is just to give you a little orientation of where we will be having our whole story. Now let's do a run through of our a cast of characters, as it were. Even though this is a pretty short story with not a lot of plot, there's actually kind of a lot of characters, it seems, right? We have Gregor Samsa, right? And what we know about him from chapter 1 is that he's a commercial traveler, or a salesman, if you will. And he's also the breadwinner of the family, right? He seems to be running the show, not running the show, but at least earning all the money that his parents use and his sister uses, right? So it's often remarked that the parents seem to be freeloaders of sorts. They seem to be parasites of their own, in a way, on Gregor's efforts, which seem to be not really all that recognized or acknowledged, right? Gregor seems to do a lot of thankless work just to keep his parents afloat. All right, so we can return to that dynamic, but Gregor really does live for earning for his parents. We then have Greta, who is Gregor's younger sister. I think it says she is 16. And we don't know too much from the start of this story, but it'll later be divulged that she plays violin, and Gregor really loves this about her, and he kind of wants to save money to send her to a music conservatory at some point. Although, the suggestion is that Gregor kind of realizes that'll probably never happen, and it's kind of a pipe dream of sorts, right? But it seems from the start of the story that Greta and Gregor are pretty close, and Greta will be the one in the beginning to really try to help Gregor in this impossible situation. His parents are more just kind of horrified and helpless in this situation. But Greta will do things like bring food for him when she notices that he doesn't like milk anymore, or human food anymore. She will bring him rotten food because he is an insect. And the dynamic between Gregor and Greta is very crucial, I think, to understanding the whole story, because that dynamic will change over time. Okay, so pay attention to the shifting allegiances and relationship between Gregor and his sister Greta. All right, who else do we have? We have the mother, and the mother doesn't have the most fully fleshed character. I think she mostly will be screaming in fits of upset and terror at Gregor throughout the story, right? There will be moments of sympathy here and there, but really she'll just kind of be recoiling from him and not knowing what to do, which is fair enough, right? If you're living with this enormous monstrous vermin, one can't really fault the mother for finding this to be terrible. Okay, so there are exceptions to the rule, but basically the mother will just be screaming and running around and deeply terrified. The father is an interesting character because he seems to be very bossy and dictatorial and autocratic with Gregor. And in fact, that tyranny will become violent at various points in the story. Remember, I said the father likes to read the newspaper at breakfast. The impression we get is that the father likes to sort of puff himself up and power trip in front of the family. And indeed, from what we know about Kafka's own life, his father was a very tyrannical, bullying guy. And probably the portrait of the father here in the Metamorphosis is drawing a little bit from that real life experience that Kafka had. That was a complex relationship with his own father. All right, so pay attention to the ways in which the father will, by and large, treat Gregor with violence and total rejection of his humanity. We then have the chief clerk, or the sometimes translated I think the manager or chief manager of the company that Gregor works for. And Gregor is in the first chapter obsessed with or worried about being late for work, and that the chief manager is going to find this out right away, and maybe he'll lose his job. Right, is the worry. So he'll appear in chapter 1, but will quickly retreat from the story. We then have, this should be 6, Anna, who is the servant girl who lives in the Samsa family apartment, or at least is there all the time. And she will have a lot to do with the action in the first chapter, as she has to deal with Gregor being stuck in his room and having to perhaps call a locksmith to get him out. And eventually she will sort of be let go as the Samsa family has to tighten its belt and save money. There's also a cook and a charwoman that live in the Samsa quarters. The cook sort of lingering in the background, and the charwoman, I guess, is there to do the heavy cleaning of the apartment. And the charwoman will be there at the end of the story in a kind of important way. So this is a little bit interesting for a family that's struggling financially to have all this help in the apartment, but this actually would have been normal for a middle class family or a working family in Europe at this time. It was just considered the proper thing to do to have a maid or a servant, right, living in the house, or at least there every day. Whoops. And then last but not least, these guys won't show up till the 3rd chapter. These lodgers or renters, 3 bearded men show up when the Samsas are renting out Gregor's bedroom to try to make a little more money. And a very important scene will happen with the lodgers and the family that ultimately kind of leads to Gregor's undoing at the end without wanting to give things away here. All right, so we'll return to the lodgers, but they won't come till chapter 3. So you're probably wondering how to make some sense out of this story, and there are a million ways to interpret the Metamorphosis. It is very open to the reader, and I think Kafka does a wonderful job giving you the space to create with him the meaning of the story as you're reading it. I think there's really no wrong way to interpret the Metamorphosis. But there have been suggested a few dominant themes going on in the story. And so in order to get a grip on those themes, I have proposed 4 possible interpretive lenses through which you can read the story. And what I mean by that is, imagine putting on a set of glasses that sort of focuses your reading on one particular thematic or set of themes rather than others. And this is not to say that that lens is true and others are false, but it's just a way of organizing your reading. There are at least four here, but I think there are others we could consider. But just to give you four for the sake of getting the ball rolling. The first would be religion. I mentioned the idea of an animal unfit for sacrifice. This for sure will be a recurring leitmotif in the story. The idea of God's abandonment of humanity and modernity, I think, is a very viable possibility for reading the story. There's a lot of comparison or metaphor, which would suggest that, in a sense, Gregor's transformation is akin to a conversion experience of sort, although it might be a totally negative conversion experience rather than finding God. One has been thrown out or cast out of the world by God. So if you want to really read the story through a religious lens, you're free to do so, in which case you should look for symbols or metaphors of a religious variety. Symbols from the Bible, the New Testament, are kind of everywhere actually in the story. Okay, the second one would be an analysis of economics, and the question would be, what is Kafka trying to tell us about the impact of money and capitalism or commercial relations on human relations? We notice right away that the Samsa family seems to be more upset by Gregor's incapacity to go to his job and make money than by the fact that he has suffered this horrible transformation. So what is Kafka maybe trying to tell us about that lack of priority or that reversal of priority with a loved one? When someone is no longer fulfilling their economic function, they seem to be discarded or at least considered less than human. So this is a great way to read the story, and I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that Kafka is criticizing capitalism. So if you're going to read it, look for discussions of money, the status of Gregor's employment, as well as how economic hardship or austerity damages human relationships within a family that is meant to be a loyal relationship, right? Or a relationship that is supposed to withstand economic hardship, right? Sam's a family probably will not count as a family that in the end sustains that loyalty. All right. The third would be human psychology or psychology in general. Try to look at the shifting relations between characters in terms of psychological motivation. I think there's a lot of manipulation and betrayal and treachery amongst the main protagonists. So try to look out for those cases of deception and manipulation, and try to think about what Kafka might be trying to do with the story as a window onto human psychology in general. Is he trying to tell us that we're all greedy? Is he telling us that we're all liars? Is he telling us that we're incapable of lasting love relationships when people are no longer useful for us? There's a lot of room there for interpretation, I think. Okay. And last but not least, alienation. The story is often described as a treatment of alienation, or in other words, the process of becoming strange, the process of becoming a stranger to oneself and to others, a process of becoming other in the eyes of the world. What is Kafka trying to say about the possibility of becoming a stranger to others? What forces are in our own lives that might produce this kind of alienation or estrangement? Some people, and I mentioned this before, have argued that this has to do with the estrangement of a body that is no longer fit or able. Maybe it's the alienation of a human relationship or a familiar relationship that can't recognize itself as a relationship of love. So if you're going to read the story as a treatment of alienation, look for descriptions of isolation, separation, breakdown in communication. There's tons of description in the story of Gregor not being able to communicate with the family as his voice is muffled by his insect body. And so think about the significance of that breakdown in human contact as evidence of alienation. Okay, so that's a kind of sense of the overview of the general landscape of the story. And in the next video, we will begin with the action and try to retrace our steps throughout the plot of the Metamorphosis.